welcome to the CodaZero Cure session, where we're going to talk about one of my favourite topics in sepsis. And we're going to start off with a talk by Julie Leask. Julie is a professor in the Faculty of Medicine and Health at the University of Sydney. She's an expert on behavioural science in public health, something I would have liked to have been taught about a long time ago. Specifically vaccination uptake, programs and policy. And Julie chairs the WHO Behaviour and Social Drivers of Vaccination Working Group. So we're really, really lucky to have Julie with us today. Thanks, Julie.
Thanks very much, Simon, and it's great to be here. And I would like to acknowledge that we're on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and any First Nations people here today. So I'm going to talk about COVID-19, vaccination and medical misinformation. And I'm going to start with a story of a trip to New Zealand in 2004 with 2 small children in tow and a husband. And I approached the immigration official there at the border, and I said, he said, "So what's the purpose of your visit?" And I said, "Well, I'm speaking at a conference." And he said, "And what's the conference?" "It's an immunisation conference." "And are you for or against?" And I said, "I'm for." And he said, "All right, you can come into the country." Because we value vaccination. And that's one of the good things about vaccination when we're so concerned about hesitancy, misinformation. Let's go back to the late 40s, early 50s in Australia, where we had polio outbreaks. And if you look at the news reports then, it looks a bit similar to last year in particular. Beaches closed, schools closed, ministers acting. And once the vaccine came along, there was demand. You'd see people snaking around the blocks waiting for their vaccine. There are people who want vaccination, and there are plenty of them. COVID-19 has upended our lives in so many different ways. We've had people who had to say goodbye after 36 years of marriage, or people who have been so terribly ill. You've had your own unique experiences with it. There have been families that have been kept apart for prolonged periods, and whole economies damaged, such as smaller Pacific Island nations like this market in Samoa. And we now have vaccination, which is a good thing. And this is an image of people at the Dodgers Stadium in LA, in their cars, in the queue for the COVID-19 vaccination. So it's a little bit different to that polio queue, but it tells us the same story. People value vaccination. But we've got threats as well. Last year we saw a coalescence between anti-vaccination activists who have been around for 200 years and anti-lockdown protesters and those who believe conspiracy theories, such as that 5G is a cause of COVID. And we've had claims that vaccines are poisonous chemical cocktails that cause all manner of modern ills, that governments are intent on controlling their citizens rather than helping them through the mechanism of things like vaccination, and that it's part of even a new world order. Some believe this, not all. And for many, it's better to get back to nature and to prevent diseases naturally, such as with fresh air, sunshine, a good diet. And that includes how to prevent COVID. And if you look at vaccine acceptance and where people are at with the COVID-19 vaccination at the moment, you see that countries really do vary. So the blue line is those, when you ask them, will you have the vaccine or have you had it already? Yes. The grey line is unsure, and the pink one is no. And Thailand's doing very well with vaccine acceptance, but Poland, France, Hong Kong aren't doing so well. And what appears to be common to those countries is the issue of trust in government. So trust is at the core of vaccine acceptance. Australia, we've got, depends on how you measure it, but 64% saying yes, 23% saying not sure, 21%. I think it's 15 saying no. So we're doing okay, but we've had a little bit of a slip in confidence. What sort of things drive hesitancy about COVID-19 vaccine? Well, the National Centre for Immunisation Research and Surveillance are looking at this right now. And the literature already is showing that people are worried about safety. This is a new technology, the mRNA in particular. And they're not sure what that means for the effect of the vaccine on their bodies. They're worried about whether the vaccine will be effective enough, which is kind of a quality problem because it's the one that relates to their demand. They want the best vaccine. They're worried about the fact that it's been developed in record time, and that uncertainty is troubling. They might mistrust government, pharmaceutical industry, medical professionals recommending vaccination, nurses recommending vaccination. And they may believe conspiracy theories. And that can be reasonably common at the moment. Around 9% of people believe that 5G theory, and we think that's because this is such a volatile time and people's lives have been so enormously disrupted. But on the other side of that, as you saw with those queues for vaccination, people who vaccinate feel confident in the vaccine and its safety and effectiveness. They perceive the risk of COVID to be high. They trust their healthcare professional and governments, and they have it recommended to them by a health professional. And that's where you have a potential role to play, because as healthcare professionals, you will be talking to people and they will look to you for your advice. So having the vaccine, if you're comfortable to, and also recommending it to your patients, families, your communities, those online, is powerful. It's influential. So we think of vaccine acceptance not just as a binary, you're for or against, but in terms of this spectrum. So you'll have the people who are anti-vaccination activists. They're really small, but they're vocal. And there's some of those people at the lockdown protests and the anti-vax protests. You'll have people who are intending to reject vaccination. There are those who are very hesitant. That's that unsure group. There are those who are planning to accept it, and those who want it, and they want what they perceive as the best vaccine. And they want it now. And those who are advocating for it. And there are different communication tasks with each of those groups. So you want to minimise the impact of the activists. You want to address the concerns of the hesitant, maintain good process for those who are accepting so they don't become the rejectors of tomorrow because of a bad clinic experience. And you want to manage expectations of those with high demand and support the advocacy efforts of them and advocates with good quality information tools and their own knowledge built up. This slide is interesting. It's from YouGov with Imperial College, who have been looking at global attitudes to the COVID-19 vaccine. And it shows that in each of these countries surveyed, there were a group who said, no, I'm not going to have the vaccine, as you saw earlier. But there was only a small proportion of that group who were saying, I'm against vaccines in general. And in Australia, that was 2%, whereas 15% said they're not going to have the COVID vaccine. And that 2% is similar to the figures of childhood vaccine refusal in Australia. About 2% of parents don't want their children to have a vaccine. So the people who don't want to have a COVID vaccine aren't necessarily really against vaccination in general. And that means that with good experiences and good social norming and good information and good engagement, they might shift. What about responding to misinformation? This is such a challenge at the moment, and we've of course had all the news about Facebook today, which has shifted ground in terms of access to mainstream media on Facebook. But there are some general suggestions from the literature and from communication science. When there's misinformation around, you need to know whether it's being shared, because there's a lot of it, and you don't want to waste your time responding to misinformation that nobody's really paying attention to. And it's not enough to count tweets. You have to look at whether people are sharing them or exposed to those messages. And also, is it affecting people's behaviour? So in Iran, for example, the misinformation that alcohol cures COVID caught on, and people tried to access ethanol and sometimes got methanol poisoning. That caused harm. You need to deal with that sort of misinformation. How do you deal with it? You inoculate people. You give them small doses of the opposing view of that misinformation, starting with a fact, letting them know you're going to tell them the misinformation, telling them what it is, ending with the fact. And then they're ready for when they see it in the wild. Use trusted spokespersons. The UK campaign for vaccination has Sir Michael Caine and Sir Elton John. And this is a wonderful ad. Have a look at it when you have time. In Australia, during the H1N1 pandemic in 2009 and 10, in Gomeroi country, they worked closely with leaders in Aboriginal communities, and they were the go-to people. And you then have emerging leaders during pandemics, like Sheila Basra, who was the face of calm during SARS in Toronto. Don't feed the trolls. It can be very tempting when someone says something to you that's wrong on Twitter to come back and correct them. I just did it then. But try not to get embroiled in big debates with people who aren't going to shift. You'll be wasting your time and giving them oxygen, and some people are energised by the oxygen you give them. Ask yourself what it's really about. If you have a family member or a patient, or you yourself might be hesitant, you might be concerned about the safety of a vaccine, about it, whether it works well enough, whether it's needed. Sometimes that's about other things. And for people who don't vaccinate, we've found that sometimes it's about wanting to protect oneself from a vaccine because they think they're unsafe. Sometimes they feel disgusted by the idea of having that needle with that mysterious stuff go into their body, the purity issue. There are many people who want self-determination, want to choose what they do with their bodies, and see government attempts to encourage vaccination as an imposition on their choice. There are some people who are grieving from an illness or the loss of a loved one, or they're traumatised by a bad experience with the health system, and they process that trauma through vaccination. They might blame the vaccine for the thing that happened to them. But in any case, they might say to you they don't believe in vaccines, but what they might actually be saying is, I had this awful experience. And some people who hang out in communities where vaccine refusal is common, whether it be a community or even a workplace, want to belong to that place, and so they are less likely to vaccinate because it's socially contagious to refuse vaccination. We've developed some communication pathways for health professionals around vaccination, and with a very simple sort of algorithm, if you like, that people are either ready to vaccinate, they're hesitant, or they're intending to decline. And the way you communicate with them, the time you spend, and the resources you provide to them will depend on where they're at. And so with this package at talkingaboutimmunisation.org.au, we've put together resources to help health professionals have those conversations, because a lot of health professionals don't have all the answers to the questions. The bigger picture, though, is that it's not just what people think and feel. It's not just those social influences. It's also the practical issues that influence vaccine uptake. And we can't ignore that, because sometimes the biggest enemy of high vaccination uptake is logistics and practical barriers, or a failure of systems to reach all people equitably. And it's interesting when you look at the evidence on what improves vaccination rates, it signals that these actually might be quite significant things. So, you can't just educate people about the importance of vaccination. Alone, that doesn't work. You need to make services convenient. On-site vaccination improves vaccination rates. Incentives do. Of course, free vaccines do. Institutional recommendations are influential. Reminder and recall, provider recommendations, champions, and so forth. And in this image at the top, you see vaccines being made available through Salisbury Cathedral, which also signified a religious stamp of approval for the vaccine program, which was symbolically important too. I want to leave you with this image. This is the Blue Mountains, and it shows the devastation of the bushfires at the end of 2019, early 2020. And in some ways, it is a little bit like the devastation that we've had from the pandemic, for some people at least, and some countries. But after these sorts of things, there's always renewal. And I think vaccines are going to be one thing that helps us, not the only thing, but one of the things that helps us to try to get back to some semblance of what life was like before, albeit with new COVID-safe practices around that. And so when we're talking about vaccine hesitancy, a lot of the focus is on safety, but it's always important to remind people of what vaccines are about, because that's what they value. So leaving you with this image, keep calm and carry on vaccinating, or keep calm and be vaccinated. Thank you.
Many thanks, Julie. So we saw some figures there, which is interesting. So I'm going to just ask the audience's opinion of this issue, because I've certainly had non-medical friends who I consider to be well-informed and intelligent ask me whether I think the vaccine's safe. So if we had a pot of vaccines up here on the stage with us, could you put up your hand if you'd be forming a queue here to have it? And I think we've got enough to go round. Anyone who would be concerned and would not want to come up and have the vaccine? Don't everyone look round to make people feel bad. So at least one person is brave enough to put their hand up. There are a few abstainers, because I did see a few people didn't put their hand up at all. And Nick, I mean, many of us will have watched Q&A, and obviously you've been very engaged in vaccine discussions within the heart of the federal government. Are any of these concerns real? Are you going to get vaccinated?
I think the thing that I've noticed about the debate is that there are all the concerns are legitimate. As Julie said, we're not talking about people who are activist anti-vaxxers here. But the thing that's been most troubling for me, I think, is the importance of getting the medical profession as a whole united behind the vaccination program, and in particular some of the discord around this, we're calling it the dueling vaccines narrative, the Pfizer versus AstraZeneca. And I think that the Q&A episode, if you saw it, illustrated that quite nicely. It's perhaps worth a look. But I think, you know, if we're all going to be honest with each other, both people who believe in the strategy that we've got, which is Pfizer and AZ, or take the view that there's an issue with AstraZeneca, both sides need to say, we simply don't know, because they haven't been compared head to head for their ability to, for their efficacy. The trials were different. But also the outcome measures for severe disease, that neither study was powered for that. So we're going to rely on the real-world data more than the phase 3 trials, and the real-world data is starting to be compelling. And I think what we're all going to see is that gap between the two vaccines narrow, but most importantly, that they're both going to be protective from severe disease and hospitalisation, and that's going to protect us and our health system.
Right. And Vera, you've worked with a lot of disadvantaged communities, and we've seen that COVID-19 has disproportionately affected such communities around the world in terms of severity of disease, mortality rates, etc. Do you think there's a risk that those people who are probably most in need are going to be left at the bottom of the heap? Or are there communities where it's going to be culturally unacceptable that we'll have to get into?
I think the question of equity is a very important one, and the complex answer to that is yes and no. So, for example, in Australia, we have a science-based vaccine campaign that's going to be rolled out. The people in need are going to get it first. And in many high-resource and or other countries who are getting it right are doing the same. Globally, however, nobody is thinking on a global level. I think we'll get to WHO and so on later, but we do not have the conductor to have a global response. So once again, yes, there are issues of countries where it's particularly badly managed at the moment, sometimes because of the politics, sometimes because of resources there. They will once again be amongst the last to get the vaccine and also have fewer infrastructures to deliver the vaccine appropriately, which will then have the compounded issue of them remaining in a potentially financially devastated state for longer, and also be the petri dishes for mutant variants as well. So I think if we take it from a national level, a lot of countries are getting it right. The most in need will get it first because it makes public health sense and also political sense. But globally, we're lacking that. And 85% of low and middle income countries aren't even considering the possibility of vaccination. They're getting to it, but the reality is quite far away. In terms of cultural issues with vaccination, I mean, Julie has spoken beautifully about vaccine hesitancy, which is fantastic. Thank you, very educational. So if you're famous like you, Nick, roll up your sleeve and get a jab, you know, and be on TV and that sort of thing, because it really does help, and I think we should all do that. But the reality is this, and this does have a humanitarian context. So last year, The Lancet put out a paper about the reasons for vaccine hesitancy. The WHO has released a comment saying that vaccine hesitancy, or people going away from them on an international level, is going to be one of the top 10 public health issues in the decades to come. So, and we know that generally speaking, high-income countries' education, trust in government, and so on means that you're going to have good vaccine uptake. The correlations of poor vaccine uptake include minority groups, include religious minorities and ethnic minorities, and also groups of religious radicalism as well. Because when you are in a minority group, clearly something that gets jabbed into your arm could be anything, to sterilize you. It could be to make sure that you become ill or any such thing, which is very politically loaded. But actually, there are a lot of legitimate reasons why people have stepped away from vaccines. So starting with our own sort of Western outlook about autism and immunization, the paper that came out in Lancet, Wakefield 98, that's been dispelled, but that's created a lot of ongoing debate about autism and immunization. And also in the Philippines, they had a big problem with the dengue vaccine a couple of years ago, where if you gave kids the vaccine that had not previously been exposed to dengue, the first time they get it, they were at higher risk of death than kids who were not immunized. So that has, for some time, devastated the immunization uptake in the Philippines, and similar issues with HPV vaccine in Japan. So there are real issues why people go, oh, I'm quite scared of vaccines. And mRNA vaccines is a whole new world. It's incredible that we're using our own genetic equipment to produce the particle that we immunize ourselves against. I mean, it's mind-bogglingly brilliant, but it's also a little bit scary for many people. Then you've got the political reasons. For example, President Bolsonaro of Brazil saying, I'm not having the vaccine. You know, you can turn into a crocodile if it makes you speak like a woman, your own problem. And there are lots of political reasons why people don't want to poo-poo it. They don't have the resources to roll out the vaccine. They want to look like strong men or strong women in a political situation that is already devastated and volatile. And also in the humanitarian...
Cut in a minute,
sorry. I'm sorry, okay. I'll leave it at that. And one final thing I do want to say, the humanitarian setting, the immunization
more than
team...
me, that's very worrying.
Did go to Afghanistan or Pakistan when we hunted down bin Laden, and they masqueraded as a polio team, which has created havoc, particularly in the Islamic world. Anyway, I'll shut up.
I just wanted to quickly come to Khairil. Does the CEC, the Clinical Excellence Commission, or other like organisations have any role to play in this, in terms of vaccine acceptancy or the safety of vaccines?
I mean, the short answer is yes, and I know you're kind of looking at time, but there's a couple of issues that for us have got our focus at the moment. So the first is obviously people's need to get education, to get guidance and protocols, and we're working closely with Commonwealth colleagues to think about the best way to get that to clinicians quickly. And people do like to have some educational materials at hand. I think a number of clinicians are also keen to try some simulation activities about workflow and workflow processes, how we're going to get through the scale of what we need to do and what does that look like every single day. Similar to our everyday measuring of adverse events, we'll be really keen to see what that trend looks like when we get the reporting of adverse events through the hubs and through our general practice colleagues to see what we can learn in real time. And I think the fourth thing for me would be what we've learned from COVID, which is this whole piece on psychological safety for staff. And one of the things we've learned is the need to listen. And so, you know, staff are coming back to us at the moment with questions. You know, what do I do if someone just turns up at a hub? You know, how do I talk to somebody from my community and what's the best way to support them? So there's lots of questions I think we just need to be really open and transparent about answering in that way. That's all safety. Simon.
I'd like to touch on one other thing which comes out of Q&A, because I was sitting watching it with my wife, and you said, and everyone seemed to say that COVID vaccination shouldn't be compulsory, and that was whatever. And she turned to me and said, don't you have to have the flu vaccine because you work in intensive care? And certainly we do. That was my understanding. And what's the difference? Why do I have to have the flu vaccination because I work in intensive care and it's compulsory, but we shouldn't make COVID vaccination compulsory?
I'd actually be really interested to hear Julie's view on this, but I'm just going to 30 seconds.
Yeah, we'll give you 30 seconds each.
It's not
an easy question.
It's not uniform across all healthcare institutions. The concerns about the COVID-19 vaccine, I think, are real. We've seen the stats, and we need to answer those questions rather than making it mandatory. And the third thing is that as an institution, even if you don't make it mandatory or you don't take the person out of that work environment, which I don't think we should do, if there were a COVID outbreak, you may have a workplace health and safety obligation for that person not to be in that environment. So it doesn't exclude that course of action, but I think as a message, that's the one we should be promoting.
Yeah, requirements come in many shapes and sizes, and we may have requirements for COVID-19 vaccination in future in certain settings where it's proportionate to the risk and where there are good ways of managing people who won't vaccinate or can't have the vaccine. But it's far too early to be requiring it yet because we need more data on the rollout of the program, its capacity to, at what level it will prevent transmission to others, because that's essentially why you mandate. Yeah. And we need to build public confidence with good information before we have to go that extra mile potentially. But of course, you know, this will be a changing landscape.
I guess that my reflection of the last year is that constant change is you know, and although we had virtually no, and I feel, I keep telling my friends overseas, and I know we have an international organ, as someone in Australia, I feel, and especially working in critical care, I feel fortunate and guilty in equal measure when I know what people in the rest of the world are dealing with, and we have been extraordinarily lucky. So we may come back, I'm sure, to vaccines a bit as we go on, but we're going to change focus and tone a little bit and introduce our final panel member and speaker. And we're really, really delighted to have Khairil Musa back as a senior ICU registrar at Royal North Shore Hospital. Last year, Khairil was deployed to Yemen to open Médecins Sans Frontières' first COVID-19 ICU and worked in their trauma hospital in Aden, and was then deployed to Iraq to manage their COVID-19 ICU in Baghdad. Khairil's someone who'd be really hard to, you know, actually be quite easy to dislike because he's so talented. Not only does he do this fantastic humanitarian work, he's also a classically trained dancer. And my wife would also tell you I have 4 left feet. And he's the creative lead for the last 2 SMAC opening ceremonies. And we'll do the same for CODA once we actually get together. And Khairil's going to talk to us about those experiences that he has had in those countries, something that I'm certainly very looking forward to. Khairil.
Thank you, Simon. That's exceptionally kind. I started 2020 as a novice humanitarian. And I remember waiting in nervous anticipation for my first field deployment. And it just so happened to coincide with the start of a pandemic that turned the world upside down. And in my preparation to go into the field, I remember talking to a number of experienced field workers and just really wanting to know what I needed to prepare, what I needed to do. And interestingly, one of the most best pieces of advice that I received was actually from Vera, who I was lucky enough to meet about 2 years ago at a course. And I remember her saying that you needed to go to the field with an open heart and an open mind. Be prepared for the experience to change your life and to learn more than you've ever learned. And true enough, I did. And reasonably early into my mission in Yemen, after facing some of the biggest challenges I've ever had to face, I find myself pondering the answer to this question. And actually, it wasn't till much later, months after my mission ended and I left the field, that the answer became apparent. And I'll share that with you before my talk ends. So in May of 2020, I was deployed to Aden. Aden is a city of about 1.8 million people. And since the war started in late 2014, is the temporary capital of Yemen. And MSF certainly has deep roots in this region, and it's often been described as one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. And a collapsed healthcare system, economic instability, famine, cholera, war, you name it, Yemen has it all. And in a region that's already unstable, a pandemic added another layer of difficulty for many humanitarian organizations and made it difficult for a lot of them to enter. But despite all odds, me and my team managed to get there. And our diverse team is made up of both medical and non-medical profiles. And we were tasked with one important mission: to help open and set up the first COVID-19 treatment center and ICU in South Yemen. So the first thing we had to do was build a field hospital. So about 45 minutes away from the city, we repurposed a community hall and made 32 beds for patients to be admitted and to be treated with oxygen. And about 5 minutes away, in the basement of an abandoned cancer hospital, we built our 7-bed ICU, and this would be the highest level of care that MSF is able to provide in the field. and we could provide non-invasive ventilation and invasive ventilation for patients who need it. All seems pretty simple, but the road ahead, unfortunately, was not very smooth. One of the first challenges we faced was this beast called severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus strain 2. Many of us who went into the field in the medical team had limited to no experience managing COVID-19. And one of the most interesting things about it is actually on the slide. It's not uncommon to have patients with oxygen levels as low as 41%. And to put that into context, levels below 88% is concerning. Below 80% can probably kill you within minutes. And in COVID-19, many patients behave contrary to this and would survive days on end with exceptionally low oxygen levels. So what that meant for our patients, some of them didn't even know that they were sick. A lot of them exhibited this phenomenon of silent hypoxia, which basically means that despite the low oxygen levels they had, many of them didn't display the signs and symptoms we would expect, like confusion or breathlessness. And certainly in our facility, most patients would present 10 days after the onset of their symptoms. The patient challenges didn't end there. Within days of opening, were completely overwhelmed. At the time we were there, we were the only facility treating COVID-19 patients. In Aden, most of the hospitals were terrified of COVID, so refused to treat or admit these patients. And many would travel hours and hours to get to us. And despite the difficulties, we persevered, and we provided them what their bodies are in such short, desperate need of. And that's oxygen, and they needed lots and lots of it. And in Aden, unfortunately, we had no access to liquid oxygen or centralized oxygen, and most of our supply came in these big, bulky cylinders. And we would use upwards to 170 cylinders each day to treat our patients. And the logistical challenge of transporting, procuring, delivering these oxygen safely to patients is enormous. And of course, the supply challenges didn't end there. We had very restricted access to everything you might need to treat a patient in a hospital. So that included PPE, that included essential drugs, that included monitoring equipment. We just had very restricted supply of until our international order was finally able to be flown into us weeks later after we opened. And it's hard to appreciate, actually, even with just 7 ICU patients, how much drugs some of these patients need. Like, we would use upwards of 100 vials of sedatives in our ICU. And that will bring us to one of our biggest challenges of providing ICU-level care in the field. This is a slide, a photo of one of our patients. She had severe COVID-19 and required intubation and to be placed on the ventilator. And to the uninitiated, it looks like she's got everything she needs. She has a couple of pumps to deliver drugs, a monitor, a ventilator. But it turns out you need a lot more than this. And I wanted to contrast this with what quaternary ICUs would look like in high-income countries. And this would be similarly what I would normally have in the ICU I work in Sydney. In this room, you've got monitoring equipment, sophisticated pieces of technology that can help support most organs in the body when they fail. And in patients with severe COVID-19, many of them progress to having kidney and heart failure, things we just couldn't treat in the field. And more importantly is what's not in this room, and that's the people required to look after ICU patients. And I don't just mean doctors and nurses, I mean physiotherapists, dietitians, pharmacists, medical specialists like hematologists and cardiologists we just had no access to. And you can imagine in a city of 1.8 million people only having 7 beds to treat COVID-19 patients, how crazy that is. So what did that mean for us overall? So this is a photo of a mass burial ground in Aden at the time I was there. During the height of the pandemic, the city reported an 8 times increase in the daily death rate. And we certainly saw it firsthand. In our hospital, hundreds would die from COVID-19. And you can imagine as a treating clinician and being at the center of it all, how that feels. I remember calling a friend back home when I was in Aden, and I described it as like being in hell on earth. You feel so much pain, you feel so much anger and despair. And the pain you feel would rip your soul to pieces every single day. But I soon discovered that it is pain that gives you purpose. And with each day, the sun still rises. And you find comfort in a lot of different places. You find comfort in the people down in the trenches with you. You find comfort in the Yemeni spirit, which is so stubbornly strong and resilient. And you find comfort, perhaps, in knowing that everyone tried the best they could in exceptionally difficult circumstances. And of course, there were little wins along the way. This is a photo of the first intubated patient that we taught our team to prone. And proning, for those who don't know, basically means turning a patient onto their stomach to help improve oxygen delivery to the lungs. And as you can see by the number of people in the room, what a big undertaking it is. And I felt quite proud to be able to bring some of this knowledge that I learned myself in my ICU in Sydney to the people of Yemen and train our doctors and nurses to be able to perform it safely and basically give them another tool in which to manage patients with severe respiratory failure. So we come back to the start. So what is the difference? In the grand scheme of things, there is no difference. It's all different ways to just describe a terrible situation. And for me, Aden was terrible, but it was also equal parts incredible. It was equal parts extraordinary. And I did learn a lot in the end. I learned a lot about myself. I learned a lot about humanity. I learned what the activist Jill Hicks meant about the power of a handhold, and sometimes how it doesn't matter how knowledgeable, how skilled you think you are, sometimes all you can do is hold the patient's hand and give them comfort when they are dying. I learned as well that the smallest grain of hope can carry you through the darkest of times. And it's actually that hope that brings me here today, to remind all of us that our humanity lies in our ability to care for others, to speak up for those without voices, and to stand up for those who are marginalized and vulnerable. What COVID-19 taught me in the end was that it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter where you live. At the end of the day, adversity affects us all. And in the end, all we can do to get out of the dark is to be together, hand in hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Khairil. Feel even more guilty now. We shouldn't feel guilt, but that's an extraordinary experience you've had. And I think your reflections on that, the slide I put up at the beginning, the bit on the side about COVID-19 was from an anaesthetist in the UK, and it's in The Guardian, which tells you a bit about my political affiliations, that I read that sort of paper. But and it talked about the heartbreak of having to intubate people who are very unlikely ever to come off the ventilator, who are young with this disease, and something that, again, we've been spared here. So we're going to just the next section to talk a little bit about the clinical management of COVID, and maybe starting. Vera and Nick, you both have experience of working overseas and working with humanitarian organisations. So maybe a comment from both of you on Khairil's presentation, and whether we touched a bit in talking about vaccines, about this equity issue, and do we have faith in international institutions any longer? You can fight amongst yourselves for who goes first, and I'll shut you up if you're going on too long.
Well, I'll go first, because I just want to be the first one to say thank you very much for that presentation. That was amazing. I've seen a few of those. I've not seen many so heartfelt and really so emblematic of how difficult it must have been on your first mission as a humanitarian, but also during a pandemic. There won't be many people around the world who have experienced that. We saw the questions, so I got some time to prepare, so I can be nice and quick. But the thing about international institutions is you can't judge their effectiveness by what they're doing at the moment. It's imagine what would be happening if they weren't around. They're never going to do enough. If this sort of thing is happening, which we know it is, there's an unspoken, unheard of tragedy going on in the world at the moment. And yet there are international institutions that are doing something about it. MSF is an international institution, but what would the world be like without the WHO? What would the world be like without middle-income countries like Singapore that drove the COVAX initiative that is going to deliver vaccine around the world? But it's obviously not happening enough, and I don't claim to sit here and say that even the Australian government is doing enough in this regard. There are some interesting things that are going on regionally in the Pacific where we're going to assist by having regulatory assistance and practical operational assistance, and the vaccines themselves. You know, I hope that they can be delivered free of charge, and they should be. Some companies are doing it at cost. Some are making an undisclosed profit. I'm not even going to mention which ones they are, but they should just be given out for free, really, along with all the technical assistance that we can provide to be able to mass vaccinate the world's population as soon as we can.
And like now, I want to thank you, Khairil. That was really, I can tell that you're very moved by your experience, and you're the real deal. So that you know, after that experience, welcome to the whole humanitarian riddle, really. So, but what I wanted to say, as an offshoot to your presentation, is that many of you will know that MSF was a philosophical child of the ICRC, and one of the ICRC's greatest contribution to sepsis in humanitarian settings, because after all, when field hospitals are set up, that's what it's trying to do. It's actually trying to bring some order into the disorder, but this order has some very specific components, which I feel is one of the ICRC's greatest contribution to the humanitarian world. They produced this book called Hospitals for War Wounded in 2005. It is a spectacular document, and it's about from everything, how to build a hospital, to the philosophy about it, how to pay your staff, how do you train untrained staff, and so on. But the only thing that has a red box in the whole book is this, and I think it's wonderful. So what the wounded, or you can say the sick or the septic, what they need is access, which we've spoken about before, to a safe place that has water and power, and with competent surgeons, or call this competent doctors, looked after by good nursing staff, which is your point about all the other people, in a well-organized system with good supplies. So in other words, it needs infrastructure and it needs adequate expertise. So no organization or no institution can do anything against sepsis or COVID without good infrastructure and adequate expertise. I think these are completely key, and I always hold these very, very dear to myself.
So I'll throw this to Julie, but if you want to bat it off to someone else. It's interesting that a component of this is where I'm reading in the newspapers about vaccination and delivery of vaccines being used basically for political or geopolitical power and influence. Is that something we should be concerned about, or we just think, oh, look, if country A wants to deliver large amounts of vaccine to our region of the world or to Africa, because it's got ulterior motives, that's okay, because they're delivering the vaccine?
Well, my view is that the outcome is what's most important, that people in all countries get equitable access to vaccines, and they get the needed technical support to roll out those complex programs. I see Nick nodding there, so I'm going to bat to him. But before I do, Australia has committed $523 million to supporting the region, so Pacific Island nations and some Southeast Asian nations, with vaccination and with technical support. for COVID-19. Now, how you see that, I'm sure there's a security agenda there. Of course there is. There's also an agenda to be a good part of the region, but as a public health person, as a former nurse, a midwife, and now a vaccination person, who did go to Samoa to help with the measles recovery last year, I'm really happy to see that happen. And I don't really care too much about whatever motives, political motives or security motives there are, because it means that people in those countries are getting better access to vaccination. The question is timing, but that's another question.
So maybe I could bring it back to, and I'd like a comment from Khairil as well, but I was thinking of Carrie, you know, we've, as I mentioned, you know, disadvantaged communities, even in high-income countries, are suffering disproportionately. What mechanisms are there within our healthcare system or within government more broadly, to try and make sure that the delivery, not only of vaccines, but of medical care in general, is equitable?
That's a whole day's question, I think, Simon.
Well, I'll give you a minute now.
You're so good. Look, I think the challenge for us is that equity is a challenge before we actually started talking about COVID, you know? And, you know, such a heartfelt presentation that we've had from Khairil today, and it made me remember my time in North Iraq, and where I saw things that I've never forgotten, but I've seen similar things in the middle of the streets of Glasgow as well. And, you know, I think we've got such a challenge around equity no matter where we stay. You know, from a development perspective, for me, the world is a complex adaptive system. We're also interconnected. We can't just continue to think about solutions on our own. We've got to do this collectively. And I think we need to think fundamentally differently about health. And, you know, at the moment, for me, the focus is salutogenesis, not pathogenesis. That's where my heart is. It's about health, it's about community, it's about helping who, in the main, are unworried, unwell, but are the people who probably need our help most, and how we can create that in a fundamentally different way, because these people are not going to come often to our emergency departments. They're actually needing us to go to them and to connect with communities in a way that allows their community to support them in a fundamentally different way. So I think what we learn in the last 12 months should inform our whole debate on health equity.
Okay, I think Naomi's got some Twitter.
I just want to say, Khairil, there is so much on the Twitter feed about your presentation that it was indeed a fascinating and sobering talk. So thank you for that. Please send your questions through. There's a lot on vaccines, I think, which would, you know, ultimately go to you, Nick. But I think related to the conversation that you're having, should Australia be getting a vaccine when other countries are truly in a pandemic and need the vaccine more than us? So that could, who wants to take that first?
I mean, I think we should roll out as much vaccine as quickly as we can across the globe. And, you know, we've seen that we are potentially a risk. Our elderly are potentially at risk. Our hospitals are at risk of being overwhelmed. I don't see any value in terms of the quantum that we're talking about at the moment, 20 million vaccines or 25 million people in terms of waiting. But what I do think is that, you know, a 2,000-litre bioreactor produces a lot of vaccine, and that being able to be distributed across the region and to the developing world at cost and with the expertise and infrastructure that Australia can provide, that shouldn't be a process that's conducted in series. It should be in parallel, and there are, you know, DFAT is looking at that at the moment.
Can I quickly jump in? I just wonder about, from my own experience, about the logistical challenges. I think a lot of the vaccines at the moment is really unrealistic in terms of how it can be supplied effectively to many of the places that I've been to and other places in the world. we had difficulties even storing insulin, so something as basic as that. So I think there's a lot of hope being placed into the J&J vaccine, which is supposedly being able to just be refrigerated and just needs a single dose. But there's still so much work in that space to actually come up with something that's going to be effective, but also possible. And I think that's still a lot of work that needs to be done from that end.
I mean, I think that's a good reason to try and get away from the narrative that somehow these mRNA vaccines are going to be, better, or there's people that are more deserving of them. An effective vaccine program is only partially dependent on the efficacy alone of the vaccine. It's about a vaccine that you can get to people. The best vaccine in the world is no good if it's not in someone's arm. Having done vaccination in Chad, where you had to maintain a similar cold chain to AZ and probably J&J, that is doable. That is absolutely doable. The single dose is going to be much better, that's for sure. But we already know that a single dose of AstraZeneca in the first 12 weeks gives you a pretty good immune response. The data on that is pretty compelling and is out there at the moment.
And just maybe one comment about institutions in all of this. I think the sort of questions that have been, do we have an obligation to contribute to other countries? I think this particular pandemic has unfortunately shown up the WHO to really be ailing. I definitely believe that we need a international institution, definitely. But the WHO really did screw up this time for many reasons. But also inherent to its design is that it was never designed to be mission-based, which I believe it should be. It is inherently designed that the more funding you put in, the more power you have. So it is pseudo-political and currently has been shown to be highly political. But its value was always diplomatic. The WHO runs on a budget of about $2 billion a year, which is less than most universities, which Julie will know, and which is painful. And in times like this, we look to it and say, oh, please help, help, help. And then it can't. But I think the issues of equity and having a global conductor, a global puppeteer of how nations should play together, but also giving proper guidance. I think we're in desperate need of that. And I really do believe that we should, whether we resuscitate the current WHO or build something different entirely, because if you destroy the WHO, what are we going to do? We're going to build something else that looks like the WHO. So I think this should be the phoenix that rises out of this, or one of them anyway, because I do believe it's fundamentally important, will help us answer these issues. It shouldn't just be every nation, oh, well, we'll do a bit, but there should be a collective moral and diplomatic process to these questions, I believe.
I'm doing a lot of work with WHO at the moment around vaccine uptake, and they're not dead yet. I agree, there's a lot to be done, but this is a marvellous organisation with huge potential, capable people, massive commitment. They're in multiple countries. They've been terribly hampered by a lack of funding. You look, for example, at the fact that they declared vaccine hesitancy as one of the top 10 threats to global health in 2019. Also, health security issues and failed primary care, which also contribute to low vaccination rates, including in Yemen. They have 2 people, and for a time recently, just 1 person dedicated to vaccine acceptance and demand. And they have to outsource a lot of their work, including to people like me. So they are terribly under-resourced and a little bit bureaucratic as well, but they are also doing excellent stuff. And I wouldn't like to think that we need to reinvent the wheel, but just strengthen it.
I'll add a little personal comment, because obviously this is part of, sepsis was the 3rd priority identified when CODA was set up after the planetary health or climate science, or whatever we wish to call that, then equity in health care, and then sepsis and antimicrobial resistance after that. And in fact, the WHO did pass the WHA in 2017 passed a resolution on sepsis, and I've been involved with them in trying to enact the resolution, and it became very apparent to me, as someone who was very naive about the WHO and hadn't really worked with them before, exactly what you said: under-resourced, very committed people, but absolutely no budget to, it passed a resolution which called for a massive change without a budget to deal with it. And unfortunately, a lot does come down to money. So we wanted to talk a bit about moving. I mean, I don't think we can get away from the pandemic. No matter how hard we try, we will keep pivoting back to it. But to try and talk a little bit about some of the similarities and differences between, we've seen this phenomenal response, understandably, to COVID-19, highly infectious, lots of people getting sick all at the same time, threatening to overwhelm healthcare systems, destroy economies, etc. So not surprisingly, the response to that has been enormous. Now, I don't know what the up-to-date figures are, but during the first 6 months of the pandemic, there were about 1 million deaths. And if the global burden of disease figures are right, during that 6 months, there would have been over 5.5 million deaths from everyday sepsis. So we have this problem with sepsis, which is not really, it's not actually an ICU disease, although that's where you end up if it's bad in high-income countries. And we've all sorts of kind of protocols and mandates within hospitals introduced to deal with the pandemic. And I was going to kind of throw this to Khairil. We know that it was 40%, but now 60% of Australians have heard about sepsis, we believe, from our surveys. It kills about 8,000 Australians every year. 100% know about COVID. Why haven't we had a successful public campaign about sepsis?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And we've put a lot of resource, I think, into raising awareness and educating in hospital, clinicians and clinical teams. We've not put enough effort and investment into that public awareness, Simon. And just listening to Julie's presentation, I was thinking we should sit down and dissect all those learnings from COVID and think about how we use that for messaging at scale, for connecting with people to make it relevant, to look at community leaders to get the messages out as well. From a COVID perspective, we have bombarded every social media platform and we've exploited it to, I think, our benefit. And people have connected, we'll need a source of truth for that. Because one of the other things that we've learned is when you've got too much communication, people get confused and they don't know where to go. So I think it needs to be focused. But I would value, on top of where we've started in the clinical environment, to now go out and really think about how we connect with people without putting public notices in hospitals and just general practice. It's how can we actually get it out into community, Simon?
Maybe an open comment from do you think it's the fact that we all felt personally threatened by COVID?
That is exactly what I was about to say. I mean, and the important thing is to learn the lessons, but also understand the ones that won't necessarily be transferable. And the idea that we've got a collective international sort of humanity-wide sense of vulnerability here is in part not built up by the disease itself, which is mild in young people, but by 2 decades of saying the next pandemic, the next pandemic, the next pandemic, here it is. We're all completely freaked out by this. But if on any given day I had a choice between having a Staphylococcus aureus bacteremia and COVID-19, at my age, I would take COVID-19 every single day. But the sepsis is potentially a bigger problem, as you've said, with the number of deaths. So we have to try and create that sense of maybe even vulnerability in the community, but certainly within hospitals. We've had a collective push together to get things done with COVID, and sepsis, it just gets drowned out, and it shouldn't. But we've got to find a way to have that sort of collective voice at a hospital level. And
I was going to ask Vera to comment on it. So we got these protocols and mandates, and at the moment the things around COVID are, understandably extraordinarily strict. Like if you sniff in the hospital, someone's going to send you home or send you off for a test or whatever. Whereas, we know hand hygiene is pretty hopeless. Should we be stricter with doctors? Doctors are probably the worst on hand hygiene. Some staff groups are particularly bad. I'm not going to talk about surgeons visiting ICUs, but do you think, should we be stricter about this? Are we to mandate people? Should we start actually jumping on people when they don't wash their hands or they don't do things properly when in hospitals?
Yeah. I think a couple of comments. I've got a couple of pictures. If I don't know if they can be brought up, here we go, to remind me to say a couple of things on this. I took these in the Congo, and just coming back to the issue of why coronavirus we've been so successful, but with sepsis, I feel that it's fundamentally two different problems. So when we consider sepsis, 85% of sepsis happens in low and middle income countries, and it's because there are social determinants of sepsis. It's to do with prevention, to do with sanitation, to do with education, early detections, antibiotic stewardship, early treatment, and so on. And it's not a laser focus of, well, we've got this gnarly little virus, we just need to develop a vaccine against these proteins. So I think it's a much broader question. And these pictures, again, just remind me that about 40% of sepsis happens in the under 5-year-olds. Another huge group is in maternal sepsis as well. So we're talking about fundamentally different sort of soup that is cooking up the problem, and it's far harder to define. And actually, to tackle sepsis prevention, which is where I think the key is in most places, you're talking about government structures and increasing people's life, quality of life, and education and so on. So I think it's very, very different. In terms of hand hygiene, yes, a quarter of hospital-treated sepsis is health care associated. So a quarter of people who end up in hospital is because we, as a medical profession, have given them sepsis in the first place. So that's a terrible, terrible thing. So I think, yes, we can't really be too overboard with 5 moments of hand hygiene. But at the same time, I was speaking to a colleague at the lunch break saying, in Australia at the moment, because of PPE, sometimes intubation and so on is a real farce if you try to do it COVID safe. It is so difficult to do it, and it might challenge you technically that you actually underperform in a population which at the moment we're at very, very low risk. So I think we need to be sensible about how far we go, and at the same time where the bang is for the buck in terms of ties, rings, watches, sleeves, your alcohol wipes everywhere. I think absolutely we can't really go overboard there, but I think we've got to be sensible in not actually reducing our performance at moments of low risk.
I wonder are we going to just go back to our previous behaviour? I don't know the answer to this question, but it's become socially acceptable, much more socially acceptable to wear a mask in public than it was before. It was quite nice when it was mandated in New South Wales because nobody felt like a complete plonker doing it when they went into the supermarket because you had to. So that was quite nice. And we've got all over this convention centre, we've got hand hygiene, etc. Are we just going to go back to where we were before? Julie's shaking her head, or
I don't think we'll quite go back to where we were, but these behaviours, all these new behaviours take effort, and we get confused about whether we should be doing them now or not, or it can be socially awkward to negotiate someone wearing a mask if they're getting close to you, or, not shaking hands or whatever. So they take effort, and you'll always have inertia, which will bring people back to baseline and back to old habits. But I think there'll definitely be new habits that stay. There will definitely be an ongoing prevalence of mask use to some degree. There will definitely be people who are more aware of hand hygiene. But I just want to go to the point of hand hygiene in healthcare. There's behavioural science around this. There's quite a good evidence base on what actually gets people to practice hand hygiene and other practices. And it revolves around, education, accountability, audits, nudges, things in the environment. You know, we walk through here, and what makes it easy to clean our hands? It's having those sanitizers so easy to access. Or simple things that observational research finds, like somebody has a clipboard or an iPad in their hands and there's nowhere to put that while they wash their hands. So little observations, the little details can be very useful in figuring out what you need to do to help people perform the behaviours.
Yeah, I think, so we've got a lot happening on Twitter. One thing I want to bring back into this conversation is really about mandatory vaccines. There's a Twitter poll going at the moment. Should COVID-19 vaccines be mandatory for healthcare workers? The majority, around 70%, say yes, 30% say no, and there's a 5% that are unsure. So I guess I just wanted to ask that question, should COVID vaccines be made mandatory? And Julie, I think you'll be able to come in here about what it might look like. But Khairil, from your experience from Yemen, what do you think about this issue? Should it be mandatory for vaccines?
Yes, in a nutshell. I think it's a bit complicated, I think, with a lot of the settings that MSF works in. Just to share my own experience, I'm pretty sure I got COVID-19, so we couldn't test at all by the time I was in Yemen for probably about 6 weeks. And I remember being very tachycardic and probably felt a bit funny and couldn't smell for 5 days. So I'm pretty sure I've got COVID-19 or had COVID-19. We couldn't do any antibody tests, we couldn't do any swabs. And it was interesting speaking to some of my colleagues who were in the field with me. And one of them actually said, I'm kind of resigned to getting COVID-19, and even if I die in the field, so be it. And that was quite extreme to me, and in some ways probably reflects some of the feelings that we have when we work in the humanitarian sphere, which is not necessarily healthy. But I think it is a responsibility, if we're able to protect the people that are working in environments and places where you are exposed to a disease that could potentially kill you. And I think for the most of us, like, we don't have risk factors, we're young enough that we'll probably get away, like I did, with just getting very, very mild form of the illness and skate through. But I treated patients who were in their 30s and who were in their 40s who died from COVID-19. And my feeling is that if you have it and you have access to it and you don't have any contraindications to getting it, why are you refusing it? Like that's as simple as it is in my mind, based on my experience. I'm sure other people would disagree.
And so, Julie, I think, what would a mandatory vaccination program look like?
Well, it would look like one that had met a set of preconditions, as I said earlier, for the vaccine, but also for making sure that the vaccine is accessible as possible. And there are some settings where equity of access is problematic. We've learned a lot with mandatory vaccination in children in Australia. And probably the best balance is to have a mandatory documentation, because that will usually push most doubters over the line, because they have to make a decision. And if they want to not vaccinate, then have an exemption signed by another healthcare professional or their manager. And then if it needs be, then perhaps they need to be deployed to another area. But if you've got a lot of refusers, you're going to have a workforce problem that you have to plan for. And as I said, right now, people are just building their confidence in the vaccine, and it's too early in most settings to require it. And if you do, you need to have careful procedures, and you need to compensate people for very rare serious vaccine injury as well, which can happen very rarely. We don't have that system in Australia, we should, and so that would need to happen as well.
Thank you.
Just, we're going to have a bit of a wrap up in a moment, but Julie, well, all of you really, but what about, should we, I mean, apart from Donald Trump, but should we censor social media? There is disinformation out there What do we think about that? Do we just have to accept it? And
I loved it when they shut down Donald Trump's Twitter account. But I just published an article, a debate in a journal called Index on Censorship, saying, no, we should not censor misinformation in social media. It's a bit of a complex argument. I'll be really quick. There are 3 reasons. First of all, we assume that social media is having this massive influence on behaviour all the time. It's not. It's a bit more nuanced than that. There are other things that influence behaviour. Where it happens, the process is fraught. It becomes a blunt instrument. And you sort of play into the hands of the anti-vaxxers, because they're saying that government is intent on shutting us down and covering up. And then you have a process which looks like that. You interfere with people's right to freedom of expression. And the outcomes can be perilous when you do that in certain countries. So I think that's a very fraught space, but I know it's counterintuitive to say no, especially when you liked them censoring Donald Trump.
just became quieter, really, didn't it? Does anyone on the panel think we should censor or social media? I mean, we've just seen, well-known TV chefs in Australia have their Facebook and other accounts shut down for misinformation. Is that something we think is a good idea?
Just a comment, I think, on the anti-vaccine sort of movement on Facebook. There are apparently about 425 sites that are anti-vax sites. And it's sort of interesting to me why they're there. And I think it's a matter of inoculation or a bit of education. And I get your point about it's almost sort of ignoring tantrums and not drawing attention to tantrums in children by that paradoxical advice that you give in not censoring. But about 20% of anti-vaxxers, they genuinely believe their worldview. So it's not that they've got some ulterior motive. But about the other 80% is about either selling some other quack treatment that they want to get out to the communities that would buy that, or it's for the advertising space, because in terms of humans, you'll know more, Julie, and others, no one can resist a good conspiracy theory. So we all go and read these things, and then we get sold, gym equipment or whatever that we have. So the reasons, I think, to me, that made me think, wow, if we're actually educated, but also humans like to be smart or be seen to be smart, to ignore things that are false as well, because, oh, I know better, yep. So I think it would be a matter of education of when you see things like that, and they teach children that in Scandinavia as part of the national curriculum, how to spot fake news or how to think critically about social media. And I think we should think very hard in our national policy about immunizing our children cognitively there. But I agree it's a little bit of a slippery slope, because who then does the policing of the censorship? I think that is a very, very fraught area.
Well, that's easy. That would be me. I'll take care of that. Okay. Now, we're going to close up we have told our panelists that we would give them 2 minutes to each to address one or all of the following. What about COVID keeps you awake at night? What are the lessons for society and the healthcare system when hopefully the pandemic has passed? And if you had the power, what is the one thing you would change? And I would like to start at this end with Nick and just go that way and finish with Khairil.
Okay. So I thought a lot about this one, and I've got to be a little careful with my words, but what keeps me up at night at the moment is members of a hardcore sort of activist group of our profession who are fitting the vaccine data into their own narrative about which vaccine is better or worse, and potentially that having a negative influence on healthcare worker vaccine uptake or community vaccine uptake in Australia. I don't know how to deal with that, except for being as honest and transparent as we possibly can, but that is what's keeping me up at night. What can we learn from COVID? I think it's about, in a hospital health system setting, we can't not everything will have the priority of COVID ever again, but we do need to create coalitions, shared sense of either vulnerability or action, and particularly from a sepsis point of view, that's going to be good and an important thing to do. And what could I change? Probably the Constitution. I'm not sure that Federation's done us any favours. I think I'm going to get in trouble for that.
But, well, that's interesting.
No, you're not allowed.
I'm not allowed to join in, am I?
No.
That's well done,
go on,
Nick.
jump
That's
in.
under your 2 minutes. Okay, Vera.
If I'm completely honest, I'm kept up at night about when I can travel and see family, new members of family I've never met, ailing relatives, and that really does worry me. But I think that's emblematic of the massive task ahead of the end game with COVID. What are we going to do as an international community until we can normalize our lives again in a very sensible health and economic way? What are we going to learn? I think we still have yet to find out what we're going to learn. But I think the vital thing is that we have a scientific dissection of the learning points from what cultures and governments and political systems have been advantageous, what can others do, and also all the medical stuff as well, vaccines, mRNA technology, and so on. If the one thing I could change, I would revitalize, resuscitate the World Health Organization. I think she is a jewel in our public health crown that we lose the shine of, is a terrible thing to do. It's very, very sad, and I think we need to think very long and hard about that.
Thanks. Carrie?
Thanks, Simon. What keeps me awake at night is similar to Vera, because it's quite personal for me, which is that, when you haven't seen your grandchildren personally for 18 months, it's something that affects us all. And we've all got our own personal story about that. And I think that is what makes it real and relevant to us all. I think in terms of what we've learned, I think there's so many things that we've learned in the last 12 plus months that we should not forget on and we should protect. It's the acceleration of how we've learned, we've implemented at scale, we've innovated. We can't lose that. It's that sense of equity, which we've spoken about. For me, it's also people's focus on standardization, evidence base, information and knowledge, and how do we get that to people. But what people talk to me most about is what they say is that what's hit people the most is our need to focus on well-being and the psychological safety of our staff and the people that we work with and connect with every day. And that, for me, the one thing that should change, if we're going to really think about prioritising it, is listening to what our communities clinically are saying to us, that we need to start putting that at the heart of everything we do and be transparent and empathic and much more focused on how people feel delivering care, not just how they deliver care.
So question one, there's going to be a lot of traumatised healthcare workers globally after this. And that's one of the things that concerns me, how we help people process that trauma. I'm also, hoping and concerned that we'll have a good vaccine rollout. There will be hiccups along the way, but I hope that it goes well overall. What we've learned, I want the next pandemic to have behavioural science advice at the centre of government advice. It didn't happen with this one. And we were calling for it in 2009. I want to see that happen with the next pandemic because there's so much we know about human behaviour, about good communication, including crisis communication, that we can share with governments and people working with governments. And finally, I hope that we include nurses more in the planning around the vaccine program that we're doing now. They are the ones who usually deliver vaccines in the community, even if it's through general practice. And yet there's a little bit of a blind spot there in the federal planning right now, and I hope that will be fixed. That's it.
I think for me, similarly to Vera and Carrie, I think what keeps me up at night is figuring out when I'll see my family again. Most of them are overseas. I think that's a sentiment a lot of us share. In terms of lessons I learned, this is probably a bit of a tangent, but I remember when I was in Yemen, feeling completely helpless about the situation and just taking it, not questioning why the situation was so, and just feeling like it was just the way it is, and I couldn't question it. And I think that was part of the difficulties I faced after the mission ended. And I remember telling myself before my deployment to Iraq that I was going to do something different. And that thing was to stand up and fight, because I think, especially as a junior doctor, going through your training in the places that we go through, sometimes we just accept things as is. It's so easy for us to just bend over and take it, to say that crudely. And you don't have to. Like, I realized that in the end, you have power. You have so much power to stand up for what is right. And if there are things that are happening at the moment that you're seeing that is unjust and that people are suffering as a result of, you have a responsibility and you have the power to actually stand up and fight against it. And that made my experience in Iraq significantly better in the end, because with government officials, ministers, I just didn't care. Like, I just stood up for what I believed in to be right for my patients, for the people that I worked with. And interestingly, it created a really positive outcome in the end. And so I just want to empower, especially the doctors and the trainees that are around or who might be listening, fight for the system that you believe in, fight for a better future. We're all in this together. Like, I really, truly believe that, and we have to help those in need. So we have many, many seconds on this earth, and I feel like every second is a chance for us to make it a better place. So.
Thank you. We have to wrap up now, unfortunately. Just want to thank the panel for all your inspirational and thought-provoking comments, and of course to Prof. Finfa for leading the discussion there. It's truly wonderful. And we'd like to, we're proud to collaborate with MSD, who is sponsoring this educational event. And MSD is committed to combating infectious diseases, the rise of antimicrobial resistance, and to developing effective responses to the current pandemic. So thank you.